Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. Welcome. There are plenty of seats, so help yourself to one. We are incredibly delighted to welcome you to this evening's program. My name is Khalil Gibran Muhammad. I am a member of the Board of Trustees of MoMA, as well as the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. That was not meant to be an applause line. It gives me great pleasure to be part of tonight's Equity series. This series was conceived by Leah Dickerman, our Marlene Hess curator of painting and sculpture, and a number of others who participated in a larger project to celebrate the Great Migration series of the Harlem painter Jacob Lawrence. You might have seen the show, One Way Ticket. In light of a larger conversation that we've been having for quite a long time, I think it's a perennial question in some corners, but more particularly out of that collaboration, a relationship between the MoMA and the Schomburg Center grew and prospered and brought forth the Equity series. The first installment of the Equity series featured a conversation on racial equity, featuring Bryan Stevenson, founder and director of the Equal Justice Initiative, to talk about his Lynching Markers project and the building of a museum, currently titled From Slavery to Mass Incarceration. Both projects place history, truth, and reconciliation at the center of the racial justice movement today. In Bryan Stevenson's words, our greater proximity with the past calls us to be closer to the victims of state violence today, an indispensable prerequisite to making the future better than our present. Tonight, on behalf of the Board of Trustees, on behalf of President Glenn Lowry, and on behalf of Leah Dickerman and all those involved in the Equity series, we focus on cultural equity. And we take our cue from First Lady Michelle Obama from her recent visit to the Whitney Museum last spring. There, she witnessed the exhibition, America is Hard to See, and she talked about belonging, about inclusiveness, about representation. She spoke of the challenge of truly seeing America in all of its glory and complexity. And she asked, as you note in the program, how can we truly fully witness the melting pot of cultures and sensibilities and struggles that make America unlike any other country on earth? Fortunately, she'll get to elaborate on what she meant by that as she will appear on screen magically in our digital age following my remarks. This evening, we hear from three amazing individuals: Darren Walker, Crystal Williams, and Vinson Cunningham. Walker is president of the Ford Foundation, the nation's second largest philanthropic organization. For 2 decades, he has been a leader in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, focusing on an array of social justice issues, including education, human rights, urban development, and free expression. A former vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation, as well as chief operating officer of the Abyssinian Development Corporation, Darren has received numerous awards, honorary degrees, and indeed much-deserved high praise for his tireless commitment to equity in every sphere of our global community. I might also add as a note of personal affection, I would not be where I am today in part were it not for Darren Walker's mentorship and leadership. Crystal Williams is a poet and scholar administrator. She is the author of 4 acclaimed poetry collections: Ken, Lunatic, Troubled Tongues, winner of the 2009 Naomi Long Madgett Poetry Prize, and most recently, Detroit as Barn, published in 2014. She is the former Oregon Arts Commissioner and currently a professor of English, Associate Vice President, and Chief Diversity Officer at Bates College. Vinson Cunningham is a contributing writer and critic at thenewyorker.com, whose writings on book, art, and culture have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, as well as the New York Times Book Review and other literary outlets. His recent work draws us to a perennial question for Black artists: the role of the artist as social and political commentator, tracing a line of descent from Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston in a more recent New York Times Magazine piece, to more recent considerations of Black artists in light of the Black Lives Matter movement. Cunningham asks, can the artist seek transcendence and transformation? Can the art embody struggle and the sublime? What about art for life's sake? For Walker, the foundation has a responsibility, as he says in a recent New Yorker profile, to disrupt the drivers of inequality, of which art has its place. And finally, our poet, in a wonderful piece that she prepared for One Way Ticket, calls us to our shared humanity, of our humanity that brings us both to the table of joy and leisure, of song and celebration, as well as pain. Here tonight, a poet, a writer, an institution builder, all makers of art, shapers of culture, itinerants of imagination, and perhaps most important, advocates for a vision of equity that promotes human dignity in every form it expresses itself. Thank you. Please. As they take to the stage, one final note. You have received a white index card in your program. It's for you to write a question or comment, pick one. And at some point, about 20 minutes before the program is about to conclude, someone will come and collect them, and Mr. Cunningham will help to navigate the Q&A. Thank you.
Can we ask for the First Lady's clip before we bring up the lights?
But more importantly, I want to thank all of you for everything you've done to bring us to this moment. Thank you all for the support, for the inspiration. Thank you for creating the spectacular works of art, our artists, that grace the walls, the floors, the ceilings. This is the most beautiful freight elevator I've ever ridden on. Just about every space in this museum is magnificent. And that's really one of the joys of this new building, so brilliantly designed by Renzo Piano. The variety of spaces it has for artists to engage and experiment and truly have their work be seen. So I really can't think of a better theme for this inaugural exhibit than America is Hard to See, because that title isn't just a statement of fact. It's a challenge that the Whitney has embraced with open arms, the challenge of truly seeing America in all of its glory and complexity. With this exhibit, all of you at the Whitney, the staff, everyone here, all the artists have asked the question, how can we truly fully witness the melting pot of cultures and sensibilities and struggles that make America unlike any other country on earth? This is a bold, very hard question. And this exhibit isn't trying to provide any kind of definitive answer. Instead, it's doing something even more important. It's inviting us to answer this question for ourselves. Each of us reflecting and rethinking our assumptions as we walk through these galleries. And I think that will be an incredibly powerful experience for anyone who comes here to visit. But it will be particularly powerful for our young people. You see,
digital age is the problems thereof are illustrated. My first question actually has a lot to do with what we just saw, which is something pretty unbelievable. The First Lady of the United States, a person clothed in a certain amount of power, talking about the melting pot of culture. And And I think it does bring to light a certain paradox, which is that given all of the trouble that we see, the sort of material and physical and economic trouble that we see in the world, from Black Lives Matter to, mass incarceration, whatever it is, how do we make the case that culture and equity in culture is something worthy of being talked about, or that it is something worthy of inclusion in along with other concerns? I wonder what you guys think about just how do we make the case for this as a great American issue and something that we should address?
It's an interesting question because I think the case also needs to be made for the importance of art in the culture to begin with, right? And then the secondary case for the importance of an inclusive, holistic art that reflects the richness and dynamism in the country. So, as an artist, what I can say, and also as a diversity advocate, as an equity advocate, what I can say is that I think that any endeavor is made better, is emboldened, is made more dynamic, more whole, more interesting, more complete when you have multiple voices at the table, different kinds of languages and gestures. And at the table fully themselves, right? Not shadows of themselves, not strictly in response to or in relation to like a dominant culture or a framework. So I think that the two questions are important to ask. I'm not sure that I have a great answer other than just to say that I think we can find many answers to many of our questions in the power of art. I believe that. That has been my experience. We can talk a little bit more about that later on, but that's my stake in the ground.
Thank you. Well, I'm so honored to be on this stage with you two amazing people. And what I would say is that the fact that we watched this amazingly brilliant, powerful Black woman challenge us was a statement about equity. Because we have in our society today a profound sense of growing inequality. And her standing there is a challenge. In some ways, it contradicts the idea that inequality is rampant in our society, because here she was right there, this powerful Black woman, the First Lady of our nation, telling us something, and we were enraptured. She is powerful in a country where many people of her race feel powerless. And that contradiction is a cultural, to my mind, contradiction that plays out so often across all domains of our society. So it's hard for me to talk about cultural equity without talking about the larger equity that is missing in our society. Whether it's equity in our criminal justice system or our education system, or our housing systems, we are increasingly unequal. And the role of culture, and particularly elite cultural institutions, in helping to address this is critical. And the fact that an institution like MoMA, which certainly is in the pantheon of elite institutions, would take on this is a tribute to MoMA, because there are many of its peers who would be scared and feel incompetent and inadequate to really take this issue on. So I really sing the praises of Glenn Lowry and the trustees and Leah and everyone here who is taking on this issue.
You talked about the many facets of inequality in our society. And I wonder, given your unique vantages on whether it be philanthropy or the academy or the sort of the world of poetry. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the dimensions of inequality in the worlds in which you work, and what kind of work you do to dismantle that or to somehow undermine it.
So, it's interesting. As a poet, the work that I have been trying to do, that I've undertaken, is the work of giving full voice to an experience that is my own, which is being an African American woman. And so my work is largely to do with race, class, acceptance, and forgiveness. And I think of it very explicitly as activist work. And my goal as a writer, as an artist, is to be of service to other people, and to try to suggest a perhaps different way of engaging with one another and with the self, importantly. So that's the work I do as an artist, or I try to do. The work I do as an administrator is trying to help organizations, in this case, institutions of higher education, and specifically small, elite liberal arts colleges, build capacity across the organization so that the vision, values, and structures of the institution are in complete alignment with the cultural practices and programs, et cetera, of the institution, so that all of the people at the institution can thrive equally. And that calls me to work on behalf of student, staff, and faculty who have come from deeply disadvantaged environments, who are at the institution in the moment that they are at the institution themselves disadvantaged for a host of reasons. It calls me to work on behalf of people who are LGBTQ identified, people who are first in their families to go to college, faculty members who are people of color who are called to do different kinds of work, et cetera. So my goal is always to try to serve people and help them find a different way of being, essentially. That through my art, that through my administrative work.
So for me, I think as Khalil mentioned, we have a focus, a singular focus at the foundation on reducing inequality, addressing it globally as we work around the world, because it is one of the greatest threats to a more peaceful and fair and just world. But as we analyzed what are the drivers of inequality? And when you speak to economists, they give you very good technical inputs, technology, globalization, education, et cetera. We actually find that one of the greatest drivers is cultural. It's cultural narratives that justify and validate why some are at the center and others are at the margins of societies. Narratives that say women aren't supposed to be in the sciences, or narratives that say those black men are locked up because they are generally more apt to be criminals than other men. Narratives that say lower caste Dalits in India are supposed to be on the streets begging in Delhi because that's what the lower castes do. Those narratives are constructed by those who are privileged and who have a stake in maintaining their privilege and power. And so what we're interested in is moving narratives that are at the margins to the center and helping to give power and ensure that the voice of those who are at the margins, who are often left out, are given an opportunity to speak up and speak out and be put at the center. So that's the challenge of addressing the cultural drivers. Now, when you talk about art, as you say, this question of art is so interwoven with this because art in many ways reflects the other ways in which structural exclusion has happened in this country, if we just are focusing on the United States, over our entire history. And so the constructs of what constitutes excellence, what is the American narrative, have been constructed by primarily white men. And so it should not come as a surprise that representation on the walls, the formal histories, the way the disciplines are taught at colleges in terms of art history are very much a reflection of that history. And so what we're interested in is how do we disrupt? How do we disrupt the structures and systems that perpetuate and reinforce the historical hierarchies that have privileged some and excluded others? And so I am lucky that I've got my wonderful Elizabeth Alexander out here who runs our arts program, and so she's going to figure that part of it out. My job is just to say, isn't that the problem, Elizabeth? Can't we fix it? And that's what she's going to do.
The person who's going to fix the problem is in the audience. That is very heartening.
But can I add something? Because
Sure,
I think, so what you said is exactly, I'm in complete agreement with that. And one of the things that's been interesting to me is to sort of think about this conversation specifically with regard to the systems that you talked about and the narratives and the hierarchies. And so I've been thinking about visual art and the system that we find ourselves with that allows the perpetuation of the hierarchy, right? So as an educator, as a pedagogue, one of the things that I have always tried to do is to create syllabi. If you were to look at my syllabi, you would say, this is somebody who clearly preferences American poetry. But you would not be able to say which kind of American poetry, whether it's African American poetry, European American poetry, Latino poetry, et cetera, right? Because it's very broad. And I do that very purposefully as a kind of activism, as a kind of advocacy, a kind of practice as an educator. So I wanted to lay that as a foundation because as I'm thinking about the system related to the visual arts, this is sort of what I see. Starting with, let's say, freshman year, first year for an 18-year-old person. Say, for instance, you go into a art and visual culture department. You've got faculty members there who may have been trained 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and they're trained in the hierarchy. So you may be a first year, sophomore, a junior, and have only really had access to one or two people from underrepresented groups in the syllabi. That also is a kind of advocacy that the faculty are practicing, right? They are advocating for the hierarchy that they were taught, right? So now you've got this student, they're in love with art history, so they want to go on to graduate school. And what do they get in graduate school? They get the exact same thing. So in my graduate school experience, for instance, I took a course on modernism, 15 weeks, graduate seminar, so once a week we're meeting in a small room, very smart people, and we spent one day on the Harlem Renaissance.
But that's always the deal, right? There's always, there's that one black day.
It's the one black day.
No, it's like Hairspray in Baltimore,
Exactly.
and they have that one hop night that they let us.
That's exactly right. But that's exactly the point, right? So you get the one black thing that's sort of appended to the major thing, like a charm on a charm bracelet. It's just sort of hanging there. But in all seriousness, right, there's actually something really profound about that because it suggests that the white modernists who we all have studied, right, are not in significant conversation with the black authors who are moving and shaking in the world, and that there isn't reciprocity happening. And that is actually not the case. So because I had a kind of education, I went out and got a whole series of other books and started reading them myself. So I was running a parallel education to my graduate school education because my graduate faculty wasn't doing it. So if I pull back out again, you see a lot of graduate students getting that same sort of training, and then those are the people who go into the faculty or come into curatorial practices. So that system, and then those people, so say for instance you have a curator, not Leah Dickerman, right?
Of course not Leah Dickerman.
Right, because this is an exception.
Completely an exception.
Completely an exception. So you have that curator then is mentoring young curators coming under them, and that is how the system gets perpetuated.
But why does the burden have to be on you to create a parallel curriculum as a graduate student to actually learn art history, American art history?
I agree.
How do you disrupt the syllabi so you don't actually treat the construction of a semester of learning in the way it has been in the past, because we're just perpetuating. So who disrupts it and says, actually, that syllabi is not legitimate if you are teaching American history? You are so how do you do that in a way systematically? Because that's the challenge.
That is the challenge. How to do it systematically. That's exactly right. I don't have the systematic answer.
Well, no, I think part of it has to be institutions. We have to work on both the supply and the demand side.
Yes, that's right.
So if institutions like MoMA and LACMA and the MCA in Chicago, if they're not demanding people who have this knowledge,
that's right,
the universities, the art schools are not going to change.
Yes.
And on the other side, if we don't have more people of color, more women demanding that they be taught the fullness, the richness of American art history, it's very hard to imagine how this happens in a systematic way.
No, so you're exactly right. So I think it happens exactly in the way that you've said. So the first thing is that there is a skill set that we don't talk about, right? And that is the skill set of thinking broadly, inclusively, of being intellectually curious, and having the kind of depth and breadth that allows a Leah Dickerman or another curator who is, right, particularly adept to be hired. So what I would advocate for is that leadership at these organizations begin to look for skills to demand of their curators, because guess what, you're exactly right. If the demand is for a skill that curators who are being trained don't have, graduate schools will start training for it, right? At the same time, in higher education, we also can systematically begin to change some things, to shift some things. So for instance, several years ago, there was and maybe this is too ad hoc for you, but it struck me as the beginning of the right kind of thinking. So there was a program in a state like Kansas, I want to say.
That is too ad hoc for me.
So this was a summer, several week-long workshop to teach people how to teach African American poetry, how to interrupt the training that they had gotten, to expand the training, right? So if you could imagine that kind of work on a much larger and more consistent scale, suddenly, because one of the things I hear from my colleagues when I push back on their very narrow syllabi is, I don't know how to teach, I don't know what I'm looking at, I don't know how to teach it.
But that's something that we have to say about art criticism.
Yes.
I mean, the idea of criticism in this country is so stale and so unimaginative. And that is in part because critics, I remember when the critic of The New Yorker, when Bill T. Jones first premiered at BAM so many years ago, and I remember, maybe it was Arlene Croce, but whoever it was at the New Yorker, she said, you know, either this is just complete political BS, or I just simply, as an art critic, don't know how to assess what I'm looking at. And I said, it's the latter.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the latter.
That's right.
At least you admitted in paragraph 1 that you have an eye to understand Balanchine and Martha Graham and Twyla Tharp, but this black man who is gay with HIV comes out on a stage and he does this profoundly moving work, and you sit there and have no capacity to tell your reader what you saw. That is an indictment of you as a critic, and that's an
Yes.
indictment of criticism, because we see that across all of the disciplines.
Yeah.
And why is that?
Well, it's an indictment of her education. It's right. It's an
course.
indictment of the entire thing. I agree. We're not in disagreement.
Right, but I guess part of it is if we don't address it upstream, systemically,
Yes.
it is going to continue to be an ad hoc situation where we have no black curators, and poor Thelma Golden is having every year somebody picked off from her staff and having to retrain and retrain,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Or,
yes.
just go through all of it will continue to be these same patterns. And we have to be able to get at this systemically.
So I think, start at the top, and the top start with the vision, and then the top draws the change, right? If you try, you can do it bottom up and top down, but if you don't have a demand for it, you can push and push, but it's not actually going to be systemic, right? So what is your answer?
I agree. No, I think if we want to talk about museums,
Yeah.
we can talk about museums.
Yeah.
I think it starts with the trustees and the boards.
Yes.
Because particularly of elite institutions, trustees wield tremendous power.
do.
And curators wield tremendous power. They are gatekeepers. They determine the narrative. They wave their wand over particular artists and say, you're special.
Yes.
Pay attention, public. Buy their work. Come see their shows. And we don't have, at our elite institution, a community of trustees who are committed to the ideas and the ideals of inclusion. And that is a fact. And I don't think that is going to change overnight, but we have to be able to have courageous people on boards like Agnes Gund who speak up and say, we've got to change. And it's very hard because these institutions at the trustee level are receiving different signals. On the one hand, they're saying, we want you to focus more on inclusion and less on raising money among your, getting rich people, less on, and on the other hand, we say, the public is giving you less money, so you've got to get more
Gotta
rich
raise
people.
it. That's right.
Because you've got to raise more money.
That's right.
And you are going to have to rely on your own resources to keep the doors open. And so it's easy to understand why institutions struggle and why it is not easy and why you actually don't see among many elite institutions, museums in this country, a real conversation. I mean, if you were to survey the large museums and to say, on your board agenda, have you had the issue of diversity and inclusion on your board agenda in the last 2 years? I would be, other than talking about it through the lens of education,
Right.
the education program, which is, again, the Black and Brown People program.
Exactly.
We would not have it there. You wouldn't see it on an agenda.
Yeah, that's right. And so the board, so I agree with that. The board and the senior leadership are the board hold the directors accountable, right? So I agree with that, and I think that one of the things that's important to say is that it can't just be adding more Black and brown people to the board. You have to begin to add the competency to the board, right? The inclination to ask smart, tough questions, and people who have an impulse and an understanding of then how to systematically throughout the organization think about this stuff. And again, I very strongly believe it can't just be the black and brown people who are on the board. So that's not how you solve the problem. I mean, one of the things that we've been doing at my institution, not with regard to the board, but with regard to faculty hiring, for instance, is looking for a skill set around inclusive pedagogy. So we're doing a couple of things. One, we're looking to hire people who have this as a skill set. So we put it in the ad, talk to us about, and we ask them when they're on the ground, because we're looking for an expertise or experience, at least experience, if not expertise, because many of them are very young. But then we also have a whole body of people who are already on the ground, right? And so part of my job is to build their capacity to do that work better. And so I think the same way, in the same way about boards. So my sense is that one of the possibilities for board development is that boards, and you're right, there are contradictions of how you need to make more room on the board for diversity, inclusion, equity, and you also need to continue to look for money. I don't think these two things are necessarily in opposition, right? That somebody who has one capacity can also have another capacity. But we just need to begin to think differently and more deeply and more creatively. What I find in talking with folks around their board development is people get very rigid. There's a kind of rigidity that shuns creativity and innovation.
Because everyone is chasing money.
Yeah.
I mean, it is, in fairness, it is stewardship and trusteeship is being increasingly defined as how big a check can you write. And that if you speak, I'm very lucky to be able to interface with a lot of nonprofit leaders and boards, and it is something that is a trend, even in small organizations, and that's understandable. But if leadership is increasingly defined as how much money can you give, then where does connoisseurship and where does passion for, and where on your board are the artists? I mean, there are lots of boards that used to have lots of artists, and the artists are disappearing because there's only so many seats, and those seats need to be filled by people who can give or get. Vincent?
Yeah, I think that I think that this idea about leadership in these organizations, I think, leads us back to sort of, I think, the first premises of our discussion, which I think background us, but we haven't really talked about yet, which is we're at the MoMA, and we're people of color who work in elite and mostly white organizations. And I wonder, and that's an irony, I guess, but I wonder if it bears asking if elite cultural institutions, whether they be colleges or foundations or magazines, are they the place where this is going to get done? I think we talk about a sort of a top-down or bottom-up thing, but I think it seems that there has been a slowness for whatever reason, whether it's the sort of imperatives of a board in terms of money or otherwise. But is the elite culture the place where this is going to happen, or is there another part of society where we're going to see this get done more effectively?
I think it better happen in elite institutions, that it needs to happen. It necessarily has to happen. There's a very pragmatic answer to do with the demographics in the country and the relevance of these elite institutions. And one wants to walk into an institution and feel oneself welcomed and feel oneself reflected, right? So that's a very kind of simple thing, but that is true. And so the question is, in 40 years, if MoMA, for instance, continues down this path, the path that it's going down and the path that many other organizations are going down, what does MoMA feel like to the population, and is that sustainable? I mean, you talked a little bit, you pointed to this issue of audience, and that's really important, right? Because I was talking to a young woman today, and she'd gone into a major an elite cultural institution, and a museum actually in the city, and she said, I walked around and I didn't see anything that I recognized as being relevant to me, as being related to my experience. I walked in wanting, and I left wanting. Mm-hmm. And that's a profound indictment of our institutions. I would say that same indictment is likely true for our elite colleges too, right? Our students come in wanting to feel, to see, to be reflected in the syllabi, in the curriculum, in the structure of the institution, and they leave with that same want, slightly hardened, bitter, disappointed, and a bit heartbroken. And so, on some fundamental level, the thing that I am always thinking about is that heartbreak, right? I feel it acutely almost all the time.
Well, I think elite institutions generally are conservative institutions. They are institutions where real risk-taking is actually either implicitly or explicitly discouraged. And what you often find, regardless of the sector or domain, is that the real innovation is not happening with those institutions. The real disruptive impetus is happening in other places, in other institutions where they aren't as insecure, which is really interesting to my mind, that older legacy institutions actually are more insecure about how they look and about how they are perceived than institutions that are younger and sort of don't have anything to lose. And often what you find is that institutions that are elite and conservative today, at one time, were the leaders of innovation and disruption and crafting the narrative, but over time lose their edge because they become more concerned with protecting their reputation, their image, and projecting a narrative about their institution. And that's really unfortunate because there's so much in terms of resources that these institutions have. And it is essential that we do engage. I mean, to your question, Vincent, I don't think we should say we should retreat and let MoMA and Rockefeller and Ford and these institutions sort of get on without us. These institutions desperately need the voices and the perspectives, but they are challenged to know what to do with us sometimes, to know how to really internalize the rhetoric, because internalizing the rhetoric requires that you interrogate your own behavior, that you look in the mirror and ask yourself these really tough questions. And privileged people and privileged institutions don't have to do that. It's why some of the most odious, obnoxious, rich people I know continue to walk through every day being odious and obnoxious because privilege allows them to do that.
That's right.
Who is going to walk up to them and say, you are just a vile, evil human being? And there are so many out there.
For sure.
And yet,
Just sort
and
of
yet,
point.
you can walk into any boardroom.
Somebody said Donald Trump.
No, we're not going to mention any names. But you can
specter
walk
over us all,
into any boardroom
Yeah.
of any elite cultural institution and see them. And see them, as I have on some of the boards I am on, raise their hands and ask completely ignorant, stupid questions or make obnoxious, offensive observations at the board table, and no one says anything to them. Because in this increasingly unequal America, we need their money. And so we sit and allow them to pollute our air and corrupt us. And we wonder why our politics are what they are today.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems to me, to your point, with so much sort of embarrassing behavior, and also kind of what we were talking about before in terms of a sort of constitutional conservatism. It seems to me that part of the project is to make it more embarrassing not to include, to make it an institutional or reputational risk, not to include. I wonder, sort of in that vein, just how we can do that, how it is that as disruptors within institutions, how we can make it sort of not just bad vis-a-vis us and the institutions that we represent, but the sort of relationship between the institution and the world. How can we do that? I mean, I think it somehow involves consumers of art and consumers of culture. But I wonder if there have been sort of techniques and strategies that you've used in your roles.
Well, I'm still chewing on. I'm still chewing on his. I'm sorry, Vincent. I'm sorry.
No.
I really am interested. I'm thinking about what you just put on the table, and in my experience, the great majority of people who are on boards or who are in leadership positions are not vile, odious human
Absolutely
beings,
not.
right? They remain silent, sometimes because they want the money, but often because it is what they have been doing for all of their lives, right? They sort of don't activate. They don't advocate. They may advocate or activate privately and come around the corner and say, oh, he's vile, don't, blah, blah. And that to me is also an indictment. And it's important to call that out because if organizations, particularly the elite ones, are going to move the agenda forward, we cannot afford silence on boards or in leadership. We must have full-throated conversation and full-bodied leadership on these issues. And money, yes, I understand the pragmatism, right? But the idealist in me, and maybe it is just idealism, says of the two odious people on the board, you move them out. Move them out.
So I agree with you.
Yeah.
I would not want to be misunderstood. Anyone who knows me knows I am incredibly optimistic and I am incredibly positive.
Yeah.
So I don't want to be misunderstood. They are the minority. In fact, a small minority. And this is my point. They're a small minority, and yet the power, because of the ability to write a big check, gives them outsized power and voice in decision-making, in governance. And so it's just to simply say, if we are to, we have to recognize that is at play.
Mm-hmm.
And so where we started was a conversation about what happens at the board level.
Mm-hmm.
When does a board and how does a board engage? I'm simply saying that most people want to engage.
Yes.
Most people actually want to take up these issues, but don't know how.
That's
As you
exactly
said,
right, yeah.
I've had someone, in a nominating committee, in the middle of a meeting where we're trying to talk about diversity, say, you and Ken Chenault and Dick Parsons are the only black people I know. And if you want me to, you're going to have to help me because
Yes.
I do not have a network.
I don't know how to do
And
it.
I appreciate that.
That's right.
I appreciate that. And I've had people turn and say, well, we need to diversify. Darren, do you know Oprah? You have these kinds of moments where people are like, is Oprah the only black person you think would be appropriate for
Yes,
the board?
yes,
And,
yes,
and so you
that's
have
right.
those moments too. And so, I'm just saying that these are the foundational issues
Yes.
if we are to see the transformation. And we have to recognize context and environment. And it's often not very favorable to the full embrace of what we're talking about. And that's why we do need the courageous people who constitute most of people on the boards, who just need a little push or just need to be shown, here's how you can
Here's
do
how
it.
you do it,
And this
yeah.
is why, to my mind,
Yeah,
for
that's the
example, what
thing.
the Mellon Foundation is doing around diversity is so important with museums and culturals to say, there are ways you can be successful at board diversifying and being more inclusive. There are ways for us to find young, talented curators of color. There are ways, there are practices. Let's figure out how we embrace them.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that clarification. You had a question.
Well, my question is around embarrassment.
Yeah.
So we've talked about, like, the nice, helpful ways in which we can push people toward a more enlightened understanding. But is there a sort of negative enticement as well that says, hey, the world is changing, and if we don't get this right, we will be increasingly ridiculed? I mean, I guess the sort of the most recent thing is the Oscars, right? I feel like
Oscar's so white.
Oscars so white. There was a certain amount of embarrassment within that institution after what happened. And I think you can argue about the sort of magnitude of the changes that were made. I think there was a sort of a switch in the way that Academy members are nominated and admitted into that fraternity. But I do wonder if there is, if you perceive any sort of change around that. Is there any fear of being behind the times and therefore sort of an institutional fear of being exposed in that way?
Well, my experience with elite institutions is that precisely because they are so conservative and so slow to change, they are particularly interested in what their peers are doing. So if you have one institution moving aggressively and successfully down the road, the other institutions will certainly begin to look and follow and emulate. That has been my experience. I don't think that comes out of a sense of necessarily embarrassment. For example, I'm not sure that the Oscars, that they moved so quickly because they were embarrassed. Maybe they did. My sense is that they had been trying to move, and that the interventions that they've now put in place had been on the table and had sort of gotten swatted away. And then when Oscars So White came back again, right? Because remember, we had this last year, right? It's the same sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Then they used this as a way of sort of moving the agenda forward again. I don't know if you agree with that, but my sense is that if you get one or two institutions, particularly elite ones, moving forward, the others will begin to look and follow.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
I want to go back a little bit to the point about, we're talking about education.
Yes.
And how this sort of is a way into this conversation about equity. I think that there are sort of two layers of the education conversation. They may be kind of feedback into another, because I think part of what we think about when we talk about a museum is an educated and informed museum goer, right, who knows how to appreciate the work. But that also, of course, an artist is nothing without a public. So there's this generative loop, right? I wonder, thinking about the artist for a second, specifically, are there ways other than education for elite institutions to promote the work of artists from marginalized communities? I know, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a huge patronage culture, which does not exist anymore. And I wonder if there are ways. I know that right now the Academy is certainly a safe haven for many artists.
Well, safe.
Is a place that employs
yes.
certain.
That would be more.
I will
accurate.
keep it less qualified, and certainly foundations have there are grants and other things. But I wonder how you think about, in terms of your institutions, how to bolster and support the work of artists and keep them afloat as they do their work and figure things out.
I mean, I think it's important to support artists. I mean, to directly support artists. And it's one of the programs that I'm most proud of, a program that we started called U.S. Artists, which today is the largest single supporter of individual grants to artists that are unrestricted. And so artists across 8 disciplines receive $50,000 unrestricted grants. And that exists because we know that that level of money is meaningful if you are an artist. But what's interesting about that is, speaking of equity, one of the things that happened is that there were most of the recipients the first couple of years, well, more than the first couple of years, were men,
Yes.
were white men. And so there was this whole conversation about, well, how do we get better gender diversity and larger? So let's put more women on the panels, the review panels, and that will help. It didn't help. And let's make more women nominators. It didn't help because the women were also nominating men. And so assuming that by putting more women on the panels and in the nominating pool, that would generate greater gender equity was wrong. And again, it just shows how hard it is, how systemic it is, because the women were supporting men. And so it's really taken a while to understand, by iterating over a decade now, how we actually get at this question of gender equity, just gender, not race and other forms. And it's again, it's a really interesting challenge when you think by simply tweaking something, like putting more women on, that would actually help you get a better outcome in terms of diversity.
You know, one of the things that I've been turning over in my head, which is not an answer directly to your question, but which is something that is related to your question, and the reason I said safe, I put air quotes around that, and the Academy, I mean, the Academy, as it is constructed, is itself a representation of Western and deeply canonical thought. And so if you are a writer, for instance, of color, an artist of color, the Academy can actually be a very, both a dangerous place and a deeply discouraging place. So, and you have to sort of protect yourself because for a host of reasons. And so I've been thinking about my own experience as a writer and reading some of the work that you have in the Times, for instance, with Chris Jackson, the interview with Chris Jackson, and other work, and about this issue of double consciousness and elite institutions, and how do you maintain, how do you practice and create work that, in thinking about equity, right, that can be seen and valued for speaking its peculiar and beautiful voice. And the reason I'm sort of turning this over in my head is, I've actually had two very acute experiences that sort of might clarify for you why this idea of the hierarchy, the sort of norm of whiteness in American art is so detrimental and dangerous to artists of color, and therefore to American art. When I was in graduate school, it was a very small program, so every year 4 of us got in. So there were 8 of us sitting around the table, the first year, second year. There was a young man from the South. My work, as I said, is about race, but it does not engage African American English vernacular, right? So I don't do Ebonics, don't do, so he pointed to a piece in my poem, like a line, and he said, I think you should include more Ebonics here.
Oh, no.
Right?
Oh, no.
And I actually understood him to be saying something really important, which is, he used it pejoratively, right? So it wasn't lovingly Ebonics, it was Ebonics. So I understood him to be trying to sort of put me in my place, right? To be suggesting that I didn't belong at the table, or if I belonged at the table, I belonged shunted off to the side of the table. Years later, and several books later, I had a white woman say to me, if you ever are going to be considered to be an important American poet, you must write in form, right? So that's also a very profound statement, because form can be understood to be the sort of heightened symbolism of white Western culture, right? So you have to assimilate so much if you're going to be understood to be important that you have to adopt our language. Both of those essentially suggested that as an artist, I was going to be deeply flummoxed because I was not going to be writing in form, not interested in it. And I was not going to allow myself to sort of be shunted off to the side. And so, I was sort of trying to fight my way into the academy, into the pantheon for a decade. That's exhausting work. And I use that as it's a personal example, certainly, but I know dozens and dozens and dozens of artists of color who have had similar experiences and who struggle with this idea of assimilation into an academy or into an ideal, into a norm that puts into question, that calls into question the integrity of their work, of the myriad cultural voices, the peculiar foundations that they bring, the kind of celebrations that they bring. And at the end of the day, the thing that most worries me is that we as a culture are losing a tremendous amount when we continue to perpetuate and advocate for the persistence of this system that is so exclusive and that so privileges fundamentally whiteness. That's what it privileges. So there are a whole bunch of artists on the side, Latino artists and First Nation artists and disabled artists. They're all out here on the outskirts. And oh my God, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could figure out a way to get them in to address that inequality. And because I do believe, I started with this, that excellence requires that we're at the table fully, not just one or two of us, but that, right? So I just wanted to say that because I think putting a stake in the ground around what it means for artists, we're in a museum, right, that is supposed to be advocating for art and the makers. I think it's important that this stuff actually has real ramifications to do with who continues making it, how they make it, can they afford to make it? Not everybody can be a USA artist, right? And there are horrible ramifications to the answer if the answer is no.
Yeah. I mean, that seems, that's a striking story about both the sort of Ebonics thing and the form thing. That sounds to me, again, an issue of education. Yeah. That would say to that person, not only are there many, many poets of color, but there are white poets who didn't engage with that tradition. And that it seems like when you talk about exhaustion, that there is the work of doing the work, and there's the work of teaching, literally educating an audience to receive the work, and say, well, here's the tradition that I'm coming from, and here's what I'm trying to do. And besides that, the added responsibility, and that's something that I've tried to write about, the responsibility of representing your experience, which not everybody feels. So yeah. It's just that's an underappreciated thing, I think, is the amount of work some of this takes, and how that can manifest in terms of exhaustion and all these other things. Looks like we've got a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to start with some of these. One, I think this one is from Leah.
I feel like it has to be. It's typed.
It is typed, which I don't think she's got a laptop over there or anybody else.
Somebody is deeply efficient.
Right. So I think it's a question about one. I wrote a profile of a guy named Chris Jackson, who is one of the only one. There are a few, but one of the only black editors in the publishing world, and he's a fascinating guy. So anyway, that article in many ways was about a largely white culture-making machinery, and the importance of having gatekeepers, like someone who is, has the ability to say yes to a book or no to a book. and what Leah's question is, clearly Leah's question is, her typed question, is are there key figures, gatekeepers, sort of path clearers, trailblazers in your world? And a little bit about the importance of those kinds of figures.
I think there absolutely are. I mean, this is what cultural institutions, foundations like Ford or Mellon or Rockefeller do, which is to play that gatekeeping role. And the question today is, there have to be gatekeepers. These aren't just simply democracies where people walk in off the street and hang their art on the walls and say, come in. I mean, there has to be some systematic, orderly way in which to determine what is appropriate, what is excellent. So I'll speak for myself. So the role of foundations as gatekeepers, and just using the example you gave, the role that we can play, is to help move those voices, as I said, that you described, who are over here and over here. Let's put them at the center. Let's validate and valorize their scholarship, their creativity, their contribution, their vocabulary.
Yes.
And so that's what we do. At least I can speak for Ford. I think that's in part what we do. So in the 1960s, when Skip Gates reminds me, most people tried to say African American studies was a fad or some sub-discipline that needed to be buried in the history department somewhere. When the Ford Foundation said, no, actually, area studies are a set of disciplines that deserve high status in universities. And we're going to give the money to endow chairs in women's studies, Afro-American studies, Latino studies. By doing that, an institution with the reputation for having great influence in American higher education, use that influence to say, move these voices to the center universities. Because if you don't, one, you're going to lose our support, which
right.
you have come to really rely on, and you're going to lose the support of the public, because over time, this scholarship is going to matter more and more in America. Or when we said, in the ballet world, when Arthur Mitchell left City Ballet and was looking for his first grant, we gave him that grant because we wanted to validate that actually there could be a black dance company, a classical black dance company. And so across so many spheres of society, what we can do as gatekeepers is to validate, valorize, lift up, to give credit to, and to lend our privilege to. Just as this institution, whenever there is an artist of color on the walls of any major museum, it is a statement. It is a statement that validates that artist. And even more so when it's an artist of color or a woman artist, for example. So I think this is the gatekeeping function. The thing I worry about is that the gatekeepers look the same.
Yes.
I mean, that the gatekeepers look the same and possess the same
Yes.
ideological orthodoxy around what constitutes excellence, what is good, what is mediocre, what is deserving, what is not, and that we don't have gatekeepers who actually have the capacity to look broadly and for quality and excellence inclusively.
I agree with that. So one of the things that I came across in the last, I'd say, month, was an article about J.J. Abrams, the director, right? And according to the article, in response to Oscar So White, Mr. Abrams has decided to charge his readers with producing a not insignificant number of manuscripts in the final pile for his consideration that are written by people of color and or that deal with narratives about people of color, et cetera. And I'm probably mangling it somehow, but essentially that's the broad sweep of it. And the first thing I thought about was, first of all, right, so those readers are his gatekeepers. They're the first flank of his gate. And the first thing I thought about is, well, okay, but if these are folks who've been trained and have the skills to read A, B, and C, now suddenly Mr. Abrams has said, and I want you to produce A, B, C, and X, Y, and Z, and they don't have the language, the skills, the training, I can almost guarantee you what will happen, which is that you can have 2/3 of a pile of X, Y, and Z, and 1/3 of a pile of A, B, and C, and what he will get at the end of the day is more A, B, and C. Disproportionate number of A, B, and C, because that's what they're trained to do. That's what they can do. So who the gatekeepers are matters. How they're trained, what skills they exhibit, embody, really matters. And so this is another thing that boards and leadership of major institutions can be thinking about and should be looking for. So you know in your organization that you're going to have gatekeepers, right? You're hiring them to do that work. You got to hire well. You got to hire appropriate skill sets. I'm going to read this. I didn't realize that question was going to come up, so this was not a set. I wrote this quote down because I thought that it got perfectly to this issue that both Vinson and Darren have just talked about. And this is a quote from Chris Jackson. He writes, "I want to protect the writer of any race from the dishonesty of racism and how it can inflect any kind of work. And for writers who are trying to challenge the pandering of the white gaze, if you have to go through a series of gatekeepers who are uniformly white, you're going to end up with something that is, well, it's going to be tough to preserve the integrity of the work in the end." That to me is a profound statement. I would add that he writes here the series of gatekeepers who are uniformly white. I would say sure, but also who have a particular very limited skill set. Yeah.
And that understanding, Chris told me that very florid piece of sort of quote. He said that like over dinner. It was like a second thought that he was a very smart guy. But that understanding of, it's very important that he says the writer of any race, because it rests on an understanding, I think probably best articulated by Ralph Ellison, that the black experience is not some part of American experience. Rather, it suffuses American experience.
And that racism is harmful to white people.
Yes,
Exactly right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not that racism is only harmful to we who are black or brown or different. It's that it's harmful to our culture. It's harmful to our democracy. It's harmful to our identity as a people, a civilization. And that's what I think Chris was getting at and Ralph Ellison speaks to, which is don't look at this as by giving up to more inclusion that we are in some ways losing something, which is the way it's often spoken of.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, that's some part of that is what we've been talking about is, and almost pathetically, people walking around not knowing what they don't know. Right? And when we talk about not having a way to understand the art of their countrymen or their fellow citizens or wherever they are, that's, in many ways, that's your loss, right?
Yes,
and,
that's right.
And part of this is helping people arrive at that understanding.
I have an example.
Please.
So, another of a teaching example. So I have a student, or had a student, who was a white woman from Minnesota, who, like many northern white women, had a history to do with race in her family that was rarely talked about. And so she wanted to write a senior thesis on family and place in particular. And so at the beginning of that process, she came to me with a bibliography, which was she had to do. And in the bibliography were an inordinate number of African American writers from the South. So I said to her, why did you do that? Explain to me this bibliography, right? And she said, well, I'm interested in writing about family, and I'm very interested in writing about place. And I went through, I started to think about what are the literary traditions wherein place and family are going to figure prominently. And I started with the African American literary traditions, particularly African American poets from the South. That, for me, is the value of having more people at the table and the value of education, right? Because she is a more educated person, so this is her literature too, right? There's enormous strength and grace for her to learn from this tradition as well. So I often bristle when people make a one-on-one analogy, and I realize I had been doing it earlier in the evening, because I think this is exactly right, and I think this is really important. When people are advocating for equitable representation, for instance, it's not simply to benefit people of color, black and brown people, it's to benefit all of the people. These are all of our languages, right? And so when I think about my colleagues who are in graduate school who weren't running a parallel education on their own, a sort of independent study, I think sadly upon them because they are uneducated. Yeah. And that's sort of how I think about the importance of this stuff.
Perhaps in that vein, is talking about the sort of education loop and how important that is. One of our questions is from Instagram, which makes me feel very hip.
Makes me feel old.
Yeah, I guess. What can be done to make art more accessible to children and teenagers of lower income and sort of neighborhoods, diverse backgrounds?
I mean, I think this is one of the great tragedies of growing inequality, is that children who are middle income and upper income have seen no loss in their appreciation, their exposure to, their engagement in the arts. In fact, it's actually gone up, because if you're upper income, and many of you are parents, you provide that for your kids through after-school programs or through weekend visits to museums and performing arts programs. So actually, the irony here is that it is, once again, lower income Americans of all races who have suffered in this vein, because the public funding for the arts has been reduced, and there is this reliance on a national group of local programs that do amazing work, but that in no way systematically address this national tragedy. Unless there is public funding for it, it's not possible to imagine how we actually can do this at scale. And we don't have public funding for it. So this is where advocacy comes in. We've got to do a better job of advocating for the arts and for public funding of the arts, because again, the private funding, the private wherewithal inures to the benefit of upper income children. And that's just a fact.
Do you want to weigh in on?
No.
Okay, great. Okay. Can you both comment on the need for organizations and cultural spaces for people of color? So sort of specifically geared in that direction. Do these organizations delegitimize our artists and our communities, or do they provide the spaces that we need? So I guess a question about the sort of ironies of places that are more specifically pointed toward communities of color.
You know, I'm still, I filter that question through my artist's hat and the experience and the struggle with consistently trying to push at the door, right? To push beyond the gatekeepers, which is disheartening, disenfranchising, et cetera. So I sort of think that way. And then I think more affirmatively about the very healthy young people that I see in the world, particularly African American young people. And I'm always struck. I went to Howard for a hot second, and then I came up to NYU. But I was there, I think, with Jelani and a bunch of other people who are doing really interesting things. And I think also about all of the Spelman women, for example, that I meet in the world. And they are incredibly confident and healthy and strong and happy. And there is something very powerful about that. So I think about historically black colleges and universities as being important spaces. Likewise, I think about Thelma Golden, right? And I think about art spaces that lift up and celebrate those voices and those points of brilliance that don't catch the eye of the curator at MoMA or the curator at, do you know what I mean, who aren't in the biennial, but that who are brilliant and who deserve our combined praise and celebration. So I think that as long as we have, and probably beyond, a system that is so segregated and so hierarchical, and in which the gatekeepers don't have the skills or the willingness, frankly, to think more inclusively, more equitably, then I think we absolutely need organizations that are focused on and have the expertise to focus on peoples from underrepresented groups.
But I think the challenge is it is not the kind of segregation that we used to see. So when the Studio Museum really was first started, in many ways it was a marginalized museum.
Yes.
Today, everyone looks to the Studio Museum. So on the one hand, Thelma has to deal with this constant sense of having to develop talent, because actually what the elites have done is to say, we're going to rely on you to do our work. We're going to rely on you to tell us who the new Mark Bradford is.
Yes.
Tell us who the new Glenn Ligon. Tell us who they all are. We're going to come get them from you. We want you to train the young black curatorial talent that we will appropriate from you once you have trained them. And we aren't going to pay you. And I think the challenge is, the challenge across all of our sectors, again, as you said, Spelman College generates more women of color in the sciences than any other women's institution.
Yes.
And so everybody's picking up from Mary Schmidt Campbell that talent coming out of Spelman. But she is teetering, trying to keep it all together, while all of these Harvard and MIT and everybody is rushing down to Atlanta to pick off all that talent that she's investing, all that human capital that she's developing without any help from them. And they rely on her. And so we have this interesting dynamic where that is unlike in the old days, because in the old days, Spelman and, they were on the margins. Harvard didn't come down looking for talent at Morehouse and Spelman. McKinsey didn't come down looking for talent at but now they are. But they're not actually contributing to the durability of those institutions, to the sustainability of those institutions. And that's the challenge today.
So is the intervention then to get those institutions that are benefiting from the hard work of Spelman and Morehouse, et cetera, to reciprocate, right? To create kinds of pathways or sustainable partnerships. Is that the intervention?
I think that's one intervention.
Yeah.
I think that's one intervention. The reciprocity has to be, if you are a wealthy institution, how do you extend some of your privilege?
Yes.
How do you extend some of your wealth, some of your capital, financial and human, to ensure that these institutions, which are so vital to the ecosystem that you are a part of, how do you extend yourself to strengthen them?
I agree.
That's great. This goes a bit to what we talked about before in terms of young people. I think people are very interested in that. But how can organizations like yours influence the public world, the public educational institutions, to create or further create a climate of cultural equity, starting in high school or below? What sort of weight do you bring to bear on those things? And this is the last question.
This is the last question. Well, I think what an institution like the Ford Foundation can do is I think what we can do is contribute to the narrative, to frame the narrative in a way that lifts up these questions, that puts forth a diagnosis of the problem, and then seeks to put forth a set of solutions. Because it's not enough, it's easy to sit and say, oh, they're all racist, they don't want, et cetera, et cetera. But you gotta put forth some solutions while you're doing the diagnosis. So that's the business we're in. Practical, pragmatic solutions. And that's what we do.
I think it's a good place to stop.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful evening. Thank you.
I'm going to say, I'm going to say good night and thank you. And Khalil was reminding me to say something about Jacob Lawrence too, because there is an interesting reciprocity between this museum and the Schomburg in Jacob Lawrence's own story. He was, of course, the first African-American artist whose work was purchased for the collection here in 1942, but the place that he formed his intellectual self, the place that he got started, was the Schomburg, and their great collection of ephemera and documents and photographs and artworks related to Black experience in America. And he went to the library and he studied. And he took notes, and he learned there in history clubs about the importance of telling Black history. And it was that place where he incubated his work that hangs on the walls here today. And so that kind of partnership, or the relationship between those institutions then is important, and the relationship that we have with the Schomburg now in the conversations like the Equity Series conversation tonight is important. Thank you for exploring these issues with us. We're glad to have you here. We're grateful. And come back. Let's push forward together.